All right, so now we're ready for page 11. So page 11, you'll not only see conditional statements, but you're also going to see like converse statements, inverse statements, and contrapositive statements. So we talked about on page 11 how conditional statements, we use the symbolic representation of if P then Q. There's also symbolic representations for the other three statements as well. So converse, you are going to switch the hypothesis and conclusion around. So instead of saying if P then Q, you're going to switch it around and say if Q then P. Inverse, you'll notice the negation symbol is back. So if the conditional statement is if P then Q, the inverse is negating it. So you'll say if not P, then not Q. So you're going to have to negate both the hypothesis and conclusion in order to create an inverse statement. Then contrapositive, you're looking again, everything is based off of a conditional statement. So if a conditional statement is if P then Q, contrapositive is negating and flipping. So you're going to negate the hypothesis and conclusion and reverse them. So instead of if P then Q, you're going to say if not Q, then not P. So if we're going to practice this, if you open up those flaps now, you're going to be able to then get some practice. So inside your flaps, so if you fold it towards the middle, inside you're going to be writing converse statements, inverse statements, and contrapositive statements based off of the given conditional statement. So if the conditional statement is if an angle measures less than 90 degrees, then the angle is acute. So you are going to start by writing the converse of that statement. So first thing I would recommend doing is identifying the hypothesis and conclusion. So hypothesis, if an angle measures less than 90 degrees. That's going to be your hypothesis. Your conclusion is then the angle is acute. So if you need to label these as P and Q, feel free to do so, where P represents the hypothesis and Q represents the conclusion. So now we have the symbolic if P then Q. That's going to be your conditional statement. The converse, if you need a reminder, is just reversing it. So the conclusion is going to come first and the hypothesis is going to come second. So now you're going to say if an angle is acute, then it measures less than 90 degrees. There you go. So again, you're flipping the hypothesis and conclusion. So now your conclusion is going to come first, your hypothesis is going to come second. And remember, this is the Q, then P. In order to do the inverse, remember, if you need to go back to the flap, you're negating. So it's still going to be, the hypothesis is still going to come first, the conclusion is still going to come second, but now you're going to negate them. So you would say, if an angle does not measure less than 90 degrees, then it is not an acute angle. So again, that's not P, then not Q. So again, you're just negating the hypothesis and conclusion. And then contrapositive, again, go back to that flap, you have to switch the order and negate the statements. So you're going to have what looks like a converse because you're flipping, but you're also going to have to negate them. So you would say if an angle is not acute, then it does not measure less than 90 degrees. And again, that's the not Q, then not P. So this is what we're practicing, just making sure we can take a conditional statement, write a converse statement, inverse statement, and contrapositive statement. So it's a lot of writing in this section. All right, let's take our next conditional statement. If two angles are a linear pair, then they are adjacent. So if you need to, color code your hypothesis and conclusion. And then you can label them. P is the hypothesis, Q is the conclusion. So if that helps you, practice writing these statements, please do that as often as you need. So from the conditional statement, you're going to write the converse. So you're going to switch them around. So you would say if two angles are adjacent, then they are a linear pair. To get the inverse, you're just negating. So they're still going to stay in the P then Q order, but you're going to negate them. So you would say if two angles are not a linear pair, then they are not adjacent. And then the contrapositive is you have to flip the order and negate the statements. So you would say if two angles are not adjacent, then they are not a linear pair. Okay, and then our last conditional statement, if two lines intersect to form a right angle, then they are perpendicular lines. So we have the hypothesis, if two lines intersect to form a right angle, and the conclusion. Then they are perpendicular lines. So to write the converse, all you're going to do is switch the order. You're going to say if two lines are perpendicular, then they intersect to form a right angle. Okay, the inverse is just negating. So you're going to keep it in the same order, but now you're going to negate the statements. So you're going to say if two lines do not intersect to form a right angle, then they are not perpendicular. And then last but not least, contrapositive, you have to flip it and negate them. So you would say if two lines are not perpendicular, then they do not intersect to form a right angle. So those are your 4 types of statements. You'll have conditional, and then from the conditional you can write converse, inverse, and contrapositive. Okay, on the next page I'm going to show you the last type of statement that you can form based off of these.